So I was here before, and then, yeah, that was my point. And then, yeah, these are questions I think that, I mean, in order to answer to these questions, philosophy and biology should work hand in hand. And these are questions that have been raised sometimes during these days. Questions that can be found in this paper I referred to by Waddington in 68. So examples are, what are the defining features of life, the characteristic properties of life? Should biology focus on entities or processes, or on constituents, or on the architecture, organization of living beings? What is biological information? I have the impression that information is something central in theoretical discussion in biology, because, for instance, during this panel, the three other speakers referred to it and talked about information. So it's a really important philosophical and theoretical question to understand which kind of information we are talking about. How should we define it? And there are works by philosophers and biologists too on this question. The question also about the relevance of physical and physical-chemical explanations in biology. Can living systems be explained in purely physical terms? This would be a sort of reductionism, explanatory reductionism. Or if we are not reductionist, what's the place, what's the role of physical processes in the explanation of biological systems? Other questions about evolution: is evolution a deterministic or indeterministic process? What are biological species? There are other questions. For instance, Albertine mentioned the question, which is really philosophical, about what is an organism, what are the boundaries of a living organism, the spatio-temporal boundaries. And then there are also questions, I have no slide on that, but these are questions, to come back to my talk, about living organisms, about life, about nature, but questions that a theoretical biologist can raise as regard its own work, its own practice, are also philosophical questions that philosophers of biology address. For instance, the question of modeling and the strategy of modeling. The question related to modeling, a question that was raised by, what is his name? Sorry. In a previous talk some days ago by Gautam. Yeah, the question of knowing what we live in and what we live outside our model, how many details we have to put into our models, and on the other direction, how general can we build our model? And these are questions that are really often, there's a huge literature in philosophy of biology and in philosophy of science in general about these kind of questions. And just to also sort of element that shows that philosophy of biology and theoretical biology are really tied together, and they are the same kind of work, not always, but often. You can see here some names. You have, I'm sure, many more names to add to this list, but names of biologists that made a very important contribution to philosophy of biology. They are biologists, they are not philosophers, because the question they raised from a theoretical point of view were philosophical questions. So I can. It was just that, just to close my sort of demonstration about this link between philosophy and theoretical biology.
Thanks. Sriram, did you have anything to add to what you said before, or shall we move on to the general audience?
I didn't have very much to add. I had a comment actually on what Francesca said, which is that it's not clear to me that a physical explanation of a biological phenomenon must necessarily be called reductionist. I mean, if you make a theory of, let us say, tissue and development, but really formulate it the same way as you'd formulate the hydrodynamics of a fluid or the elasticity of a solid, you're not being reductionist. You're actually working at the scale of a course description. You already have a guiding principle for what large-scale variables are actually important and what can be ignored. Whether it's a correct or a wrong one is a separate matter, but you have a guiding principle, and therefore, I wouldn't strictly call that reductionist. Reductionist would be if you want to, if you want to do a molecular modeling of it and then reproduce the whole thing. But if you really say that, look, there's only a few important forces, there's only a few important slowly varying fields, and you can produce these phenomena and you can predict, then you have done something distinct from reductionism. At least that's my understanding.
Okay, yeah, I understand what you say. You mean that you can provide a physical explanation of biological system, but which is not at the fundamental level, but it's a physics at the meta level of
like hydrodynamics.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's not a reductionist, but at the same time, sorry, there's something happening because you, in a certain way, you are claiming that physics explains and not biology. So in a certain way, there's a statement about the fact that physics is more fundamental in the explanation. It's
not more fundamental. I would say the point is that biology has actually set the initial conditions, set parameter values. Biology, not merely immediate contingents for a biology, but evolution. The point is the object you have in your hands is most certainly shaped by the forces that shape life, particularly evolution. But once you have that, you have a separation of scale, and you can then take that object and understand how behaviors and even predict behaviors on physical grounds. It's not that, it's absolutely doesn't rule out, doesn't rule out biology. It simply says that you can, it's a question of what you mean by understanding, but.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There could be a situation in which some phenomena are explained better by this kind of physical explanation, and others where, on the contrary, the biological one is the best one.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's a good point.
Right. Shall we move on then to comments and questions from the audience? I see only one question in the chat box. Well, Gautam has a hand raised. Sonali Sengupta has typed in a question. Would you like me to read it, or would you please ask the question yourself? And I have only one suggestion now. Please try and think of which member of the panel might be most suitable for addressing your question, so that there's a focus already. Sonali Sengupta, please.
Yes, I'll read it. Actually, I just typed in a question, but I had an earlier question. The question is for Professor Sriram Ramaswamy specifically. Does the induction of general principles of biological systems from specific examples imply non-carbon-based life? But carbon gives context, and we do not find evidence of non-carbon-based life. Thank you.
My answer, I think, really is that the kind of biological physics I do, to the extent that you can call it that, can't answer that question, really, because it assumes the sorts of forces that animate a biological system are already built in. It assumes that the system has found parameter values for which that object is viable. The question of whether it is carbon-based or something else based is really prior to all of this, and I don't think can be addressed by what I'm talking about. So the point is, if you can produce a non-carbon based but still self-replicating path to creating objects that move and sense and move around and create copies of themselves, the rest of it follows. So I think carbon-based versus non lies in a different domain.
Thanks, Sriram. I see Mohinish Shukla here, if he's there. Hi, Mohinish. Could you pose your question?
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much for telling me about and letting me join in. So my question, I'm not exactly sure whom it's aimed at, but I was particularly thinking about this description of these active moving particles in Sriram's talk. And I was thinking about the difference between sort of active moving particles and how you can think about physics to drive them. And when we think about, I'm going to say in quotes, active moving particles, which are people, where their movements are directed not simply by the physics, but by something else. We call it choice, desire. This is the folk psychological notions. And I guess the most stark way of posing the question is to say, is ethics biology? In the sense that it seems like there are certain properties of living creatures. One of the properties that we seem to have is things like thoughts, consciousness, ethics, things that don't seem to be very easily explainable by anything in some sense physical. So the question is, are these biological? And I think the answer generally should be yes, because I mean, where else do they come from except from us in some sense? But then the question becomes that how do you think about a level of abstraction which moves away from practically almost everything that we've been talking about? Now, people generally in our field, being mostly neuroscience, have been thinking about in terms of neurons and neural assemblies and how this can have learning, how this can make consciousness and so forth. But even there, the answers are not so clear. I mean, after if you look at the cortex, the human cortex, 80% of the neocortex is not even neural cells, they're just glial cells. And it's not clear what the small 20% of neurons are even doing. Is that even the right level of approximation? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about thinking about theoretical biology, not simply as sort of mechanistic and very physics-based explanation, but for example, linguistics, where you have some kind of an algebra, you have some kind of models which are not, I don't know if you would call them mathematical or not. I think the fact that you call it algebraic seems to suggest that those can be considered mathematical, but levels of description that kind of go beyond the ones that I think you've been mostly talking about.
Are you
If you
okay,
don't mind,
Sriram? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll start very briefly by answering, but I'm going to pass it to other members of the panel because Monish actually asked several questions. And many of them, I do really what I consider the rock bottom simplest kind of biological physics, even to the extent that you use the adjective biologically, only thinking about movement and force. Okay. At a sort of very tentative level, you can take models of the sort that we write down and introduce some degree of complexity in, for example, by introducing internal states to the particles in the system. And finally, when you talk about things like, choosing which way you move, those are all just making these objects into decision-making particles. You can certainly write down models of those sort. I'm saying that the less clever your particles are, the easier a very simple physical modeling is. The more priorities, the longer range of interaction, and the greater memory they have, the more stuff you have to build in, at which point a simple physical modeling, though it might be possible, requires so much input that you might as well just sort of do a detailed reproduction of the system. The other point I want to make, so I'm saying that you can improve sort of simple-minded active matter models to give the particles some degree of information processing. You can even improve them in an evolutionary way, probably to start acquiring the kind of directed flow of information that Paulien talked about. Okay. But really, if you want to understand stuff like consciousness, I am not the person you should go to. You are the person people should go to. But with that answer, I'd like to pass it to the more philosophical and the more biological members of the panel.
In fact, if I might request Paulien to say something. Paulien, you've done a fair amount of agent-based modeling and so forth yourself. How would you address the kind of qualms Mohnish is bringing up?
Well, I don't know exactly. I think what one would want to do is to understand from an evolutionary point of view how a new level of dynamics can come in given a certain level of dynamics. And so I think that in some of our models, we do certain things like that. So you could well imagine that that entities which as I said, from an evolutionary point of view, even when you look at the very basic level of RNA and DNA, there is a certain memory, and that memory can be well, I mean, the tape can be read off in several ways. So a kind of active, well, an active dynamics, as was being referred to, which is not so much a property of the well, of the matter, although it of course has to, I mean, everything goes of course through the physics, and the physics has to be well employed to get everything well going. However, well, I mean, when you would do evolve a nervous system, you do get this kind of, well, other level of well, steering, I would say, the physics, or so the steering of your muscles, just to name something, is through this other level. So I don't think that well, well, things are connected, of course, and well, I mean, that's about what I want to say about it. Lee, well, are we still there?
Yes. Vidya, you muted.
I'm sorry. Hi, Paulien, were you going to add something, or shall I ask Gautam? He has his hand up.
Well, about this topic, you mean? I'm more or less.
Okay. Gautam, you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a sort of slightly philosophical question, but it also relates to the very different ways in which two subjects are approached by different communities. And that has to do with the question of what is the distinction between a prediction and an explanation. And the roots of this question are very practical. I talk a fair amount to experimental biologists who are interested in looking at theories for the experiments that they do, for the observations that they make. But what seems to be primary in that discussion is, can you predict something that we haven't seen before? And that's, in a sense, the bottom line for the experimental biologist talking to a theorist. Is there something new that you can tell me? Something that we can say, that we can put in a paper that is not there in anything that has come before, any work that you may have led up to that point. On the other hand, as a physicist, I'm very interested in explanations. There is data. Is there a coherent explanation for multiple pieces of data? And in a sense, prediction is good, but that's a further step. And often, given something sufficiently complicated, I'd settle for an explanation that really enables me to unite a whole lot of stuff that's already been seen, many different observations made by many different groups together. So this is really a question, I'm not even sure it's for the panel, but I'd like to address it to experimentalists, for example, Vaishnavi or Kinneret or Erez and so on, to see what is their take on this. There seems to be a fundamental divide between the way physicists think about it, where explanations are useful and important and paramount, and the sort of biologist way of looking at, is there anything new that's coming out of this? And I'd like to see what people think about this in general. That was my question.
Would someone here like to take it up? Maybe Erez, if you are there.
Yes.
Would you like to respond?
I like to say a few comments, if possible.
Please.
Maybe it doesn't answer the. So first of all, let me say that theory is really essential. It's not nice to have add to anything. There is no science without theory. Let me again, read what Eddington said in 1933. I hope it will not shock experimental physicists too much if I said that we do not accept their observations unless they are confirmed by theory. So even if I do not completely agree with this, I think that theory is really essential. Second comment is that living systems, as opposed to biology as a material system, is a completely different subject matter. So, physicist approach by active matter and all this is, of course, essential component and very important to understand. but I don't think is a theory for life. It's a component we have to maybe take into account, and a lot of the work on biological systems actually throw the essence of a living system out of the framework, and we have to rethink about what we really want to understand with respect to living systems. Again, as opposed to just a material system, which is very interesting by itself, and of course requires a lot of attention. Third comment is that evolution, of course, is very important and essential, but of course, it's not an excuse not to get into deep essence of the natural phenomena we see as living systems around us. And by the way, living systems are historical systems, not only because of evolution. They are historical systems because every time we observe a trajectory of a living system, a cell or development, whatever you look at, it has some specific history that it carries with it. And every time we make a measurement or perturb a biological system, then we, of course, we may change the trajectory, and the system carries this history with it. It was, I think, Darcy Thompson book on growth and form was partially written as a retaliation against Darwinism, as an approach to explain everything in the living world. And his idea, of course, was that physics and mathematics should come in as a way to explain the natural phenomena. And the last comment is that it's not clear that physics is the right framework to understand living systems, but it's a good start. And together with other branches that might come from mathematics, computer science, you name it, or identifying a new language, determining a new language might be essential to really get a theory of a living system. So I don't know if it's answering anything, but these are my comments.
Thank you. I notice a number of other hands raised up here. Abhishek, could you please put your question and say whether it's addressed to someone?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I was recently reading this article by Professor David Earn, who is a mathematical biologist, where he says that one of the first problems that he tried solving was applying game theory to a culture of to a school of fish or something, and then he says that he failed in it, and then says that the importance of asking the right questions. So my question is, it might come out of a general question. It might even be a question for the nature of research itself. So in all this biological phenomena, we see a lot of complex and disordered systems and stuff like that. So how does a theoretician say, okay, this is my system and I'm going to work in it with all the proteins and stuff involved? How does a theoretician put a boundary when he or she tries to explain a phenomena or something like that? Because since so many things are happening, where do you put a boundary? While this is again, it's a general question. Thank you.
Right. Sriram, would you like to take this one too?
Well, I think, the first thing you do typically is to choose a problem that looks like it's within your grasp. A large part of it is, frankly, I run away from very difficult problems. I do easy ones on which I have an angle that other people haven't thought about before. So in part, if you see success in physicists looking at certain kinds of problems in biology, there's a selection effect there. They've picked the problems they could solve. In those problems, if you look at the phenomenon, it often seems reasonably clear what aspects are important, what aspects are not important. But this question of taking a problem with an awfully large number of variables and having a criterion for choosing which ones are important, which ones are not, comes partly from experience, partly from hoping that once you put in a few features like active internal forces, The rest of it is governed by the same rules as in ordinary condensed matter, which tell you that the things that are happening on slow time scales matter and things that are happening on fast time scales become noise. I think, but I think the bottom line is it's partly choice of problem, knowing that this kind of trick will work on those problems and going ahead with it. On sufficiently complex problems, I think personally, I don't have a good answer to your question. And I don't think the field has a good general principle about how to choose variables when you've got, say, let's say an enormous number of concentrations of molecules, an enormous number of expression levels, enormous number of components connected not in a simple spatially local way. For models like that, I think we are still searching for an organizing principle to say, these are the variables I need and these are the ones you throw out. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can do.
Thank you, Sriram. I noticed some questions left over from the last session. I'm sorry, I hadn't seen them before. There's one by Nagesh, which goes, roughly, I can't read the question right now because it seems to have disappeared from my screen. It goes roughly, what about chemistry in theoretical biology? I'll make a comment here before throwing it to someone in the panel. And this comment relates to what we were talking about earlier, much earlier, which is this tension between physicists and biologists, or at least the tension which Rashevsky experienced and others since then have written about. You know, this sort of tension doesn't seem to have existed between chemists and biologists. There was a very brief while, when people like Erwin Chargaff got rather upset at the way molecular biologists seemed to be riding roughshod over what he thought was the proper domain of chemists. But that was a relatively isolated feeling and it didn't last long. And in fact, right from very early days, I would say the early 1900s, when you had cell-free fermentation and physiological chemistry and so forth leading into biochemistry, chemistry has merged smoothly with biology, almost without any feathers being raised anywhere, whereas physics has not. At least it appears it has not, and it might be worth thinking of why not. So that's just a comment on my part. Now I'd like to ask someone here, maybe Apratim, how has, as a response to the question, I mean, Nagesh's question, what do you see as the role of chemistry in theoretical biology?
Yeah, so meaning basically I would agree with you, Vidya, that it has been a much smoother relationship because, you know, how can you talk about, say, for example, metabolism without alluding to chemistry or biological chemistry, right? So because biological chemistry has been a field in its own right, meaning, as you said, it has been a much smoother relationship between biology and actually where one ends and the other begins, right? Plant alkaloids, the chemistry or biology. It's probably gets to be a moot point. Maybe it also because about some of the previous questions which were raised, I just wanted to make a few points, if I may. So,
shall we go through? Why not? Okay, go ahead. Make something very briefly because there are other questions.
Yeah, no, or I can come back to it later also. But about chemistry, as I agree with you that I also think that it flows very naturally. But yeah, with biomolecules. So yeah.
Thanks. There's one question by Bhumika, also left over from last time. And she asks, do you need a new language for a new science? I presume by new science here you mean theoretical biology. Bhumika, could you please explain?
Vidya, she doesn't appear to be here in this session.
She's not here. Okay, so we'll let that question pass for the moment. Now, Gautam, have you raised your hand or is this the same hand as before?
Vidya, I don't think we addressed Gautam's question sufficiently here. So
if it's possible.
Yeah, so who would like to take that on? Apratim, do you?
No, but not as such, because in my talk I spoke about that extensively. But is a coherent explanation a worthwhile goal in itself? I would think yes, it is certain. So and it does give you mechanistic insight into the biological problem one is studying, and lets you explore things that you could not do with experiments. So yes, very much so. But you have to also address this to all the experimentalists in the audience, right? So maybe Vaishnavi or someone could also add to this.
Yeah, I just actually responded to Gautam in a chat, but maybe I'll also just say this. I think, right, so Gautam was exactly on point when he said typically experiments, when they collaborate with theorists, do look for the predictive power of theory and see if they can use experiments to test the predictions. And this is something I try and do as well. And I think it stems from the fact that theory, if I understand it right, could be constructed to work in a particular context and under specific conditions. And so in my mind, for it to make sense in a general context and for it to hold, regardless of the particular question under study, the predictions are important then to alleviate this issue, which eventually will have to, of course, have to be tested in experiments. So that's why I do think predictions are useful and important in context of making the theory generalizable.
Yeah. You know, just some passing comment, Gautam, there's always this worry that curve fitting might be going on with any number of parameters, and it's not clear whether that constitutes either an explanation or a prediction. But Francesca has something to say.
Yeah, but because Gautam's question is really relevant, and it's for sure that prediction is not the same as explanation. This distinction has been discussed a lot in philosophy of science, and 2 points I wanted to make. Just this idea that when you have a prediction of new phenomena, it's something that is considered important. In fact, there's a debate in philosophy of science between those who are realists about scientific theories and those that are anti-realists. That means that if you're a realist, you think that your theory or your model describes reality, your biological system as it is, or approximately as it is. And if you are anti-realist, usually you think that your model, it's not that you don't care, but it's your aim is not explanation, it's just prediction. And even though your model doesn't describe biological systems under study in a realistic way, it's not a problem. What you aim at is prediction. And the fact that you can predict with a theory or a model new phenomena is often used as an argument for realism. That's something that your theory or your model talks about grasp reality, and so you can predict something new that you can test and verify experimentally. So this was a first point. And then on the side of explanation, also one can ask what kind of explanation are we talking about, because you can have there are people arguing that only causal explanations are explanations. You have to have causes and mechanisms in order to explain some phenomena. But other people also could say that you can have mathematical explanations, for instance. They are different. For instance, they can be based on the topology of your system, the architecture of your system, but you don't have necessarily causes. And I think that in theoretical biology, often you have this kind of mathematical explanation. So that's also this kind of debates to have about what counts as a good explanation. Do you need causes or not? What's the difference between all these explanations?
And Francesca, Sriram has something to add to this.
I had a question for Francesca, actually. Can you give an example of an anti-realist piece of theory or a particular line of scientific endeavor which is anti-realist and yet somehow is a working piece of science? I don't know the term, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, the debate, it would be long to enter in this debate, but the debate in philosophy of science is about when theories are about entities that you cannot really observe. And then there's a debate, what does it mean to observe something? But for instance, you can, and theories that contains these kind of entities, talks about these kind of entities, could be seen as, these entities could be seen just as sort of fictions, or that you put in your model, and in order to have predictive power. The examples could be, for instance, but from a scientific point of view, some philosophers of science have said that electrons are inobservable. You can, of course, detect them in a cloud chamber, but you don't see them. You just see the I don't know, how do you say in English? The trace,
Yeah, but I mean, that could be said for practically anything. I was wondering if you meant something more like a mathematical intermediary, such as the vector potential in electromagnetism, for example, which most certainly isn't an object that you can measure, but which is an absolutely essential intermediary between you and the result, because you can't do the calculation in any reasonable way without it. So I was wondering if that's what you meant. I'm sorry to bring up vector potentials in a biology audience, but still.
Yeah.
Sonali Sengupta, is that a new question?
Yes, I have a new question directed towards Pauline and Francesca. I would like to know what they think. Now, people are 3D bioprinting tissue. Do you think advancements in biotechnology without a complete understanding of the general biological principles poses a danger or an existential threat to humanity?
Do you think that this is a theoretical question, theoretical biology question? I think this is, indeed an ethical question. You can wonder how far these things go, but I wouldn't say this is within what, at least I think about theoretical biology. Do you?
Ask this question because the principles, biological principles or theoretical biological principles are not known, and people are going on ahead with a physicalist framework and doing experiments like 3D bioprinting and gene editing. So you being in the field of theoretical biology, yes, it is ethical, but would you rather wait for the theoretical biology field to advance before such technological advancements are made? Because we don't, if theoretical biology has predictive power.
Well, I don't think the predictive power extends to this ethical question. I mean, as I said, when we make our models, we are very much constrained by this, this ambivalence between simple enough and too simple. And in order to to predict what you want us to predict, namely what kind of effect this has on society, I don't think we can do it. So I think this, just anybody's ideas about this are just as worthwhile. Sorry for being so so.
No, it's fine. Thank you. It's okay.
Yeah. I had a comment, or maybe Francesca wants to say something about this.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I don't think that theoretical biology could bring something more than, I mean, experimental biology. They both are needed in order to evaluate what are the consequences of some, for instance, gene editing, and so we are going to do that step by step with all the limits we put on this kind of biotechnologies and what we can do with them. So I think that both are, there's a dialogue that should be done between experimental and theoretical biology in order to know what we can do and what are the implications of what we do with these technologies.
Yeah. Vidya, you're muted.
Paulien, you said you wanted to add a comment?
Well, I wanted to comment something about what Francesca was saying about the the kind of similarity of questions being asked in philosophy of biology and in theoretical biology. Well, I think an important point to make here is that the way we go about it is quite different. I may mention that actually we started as a theoretical biology group in 1970 in a philosophy department, but we were pretty soon we were out of that because we wanted to be closer to biology. But so one of the points she put on her slide is as a question, how deterministic is evolution? And that is, of course, the question which has been often asked. By an experimental theoretical approach, actually we have to, we refine that question to a large extent. So what we see in our experiments is that very often some of the things that evolve are deterministic, and then we say, okay, this is maybe a very general principle dependent on what kind of context that is, but it is very often implemented in different ways. And so the question should not be, is it deterministic or is it not deterministic, but how is the relation between a certain, predictable outcome and the type of implementation of that outcome. And I think this reformulating of the question is one of the very important things that theoretical biology can contribute both to philosophy, but also to experimental biology. Reformulating questions.
Thanks, Paulien. Senthil has a longish question here. Would it be possible for you to compress it and ask it yourself, please?
Sure, thank you, Vidya. It's not a question, rather a comment onto what Gautam alluded to. It's more of whether theoretical biologists actually want to shake hands with biologists and get their theories validated with experiments. And that means they need to have a closer relationship with biologists. And that also means that, in all practicality, both biologists and theoretical biologist experimentalists do have an overview of big questions, but biologists operate in a way that they're asking and focusing on a single, system or a particular molecule or whatsoever, because that's what is in the feasibility, right? That's what one can do in the lab. However, if new theory or new physics, new science has to come out of it, the theorists, the physicists also need to help out biologists in way of helping them with complex modeling, complex data analysis, and extracting parameters out of it and feeding them back into experiments. And so a lot of people did allude to the fact that biologists come to physicists just to fit graphs or model. I don't think that's necessarily the fact. The fact is that you do need these close collaborations, and you do need these close collaborations to build stepwise process of merging the fields, so that both biologists, experimentalists, and physicists can push together larger questions. Sorry if it was a bit long and confusing, but I really think that the slope needs to be decreased from both ends for people to merge and do things better.
Thank you. And anyone want to comment on that or respond to that, Gautam?
Well, when you say this, how do you compare that to theoretical physics?
Pardon, Paulien?
So, what he was suggesting that the field of theoretical biology and experimental biology has to be merged, and that must come from both sides. Well, that's something certainly which is something to said about. But so isn't it, handy just to say the relationship between theoretical biology to biology is similar than the relationship between theoretical physics and experimental physics. And then is it true that there is this, necessarily close merging?
Can I comment on this?
Yes, please.
So I think there is a huge difference, because in physics, physics has really theoretical frameworks that are allowed to work almost independent of experiment, and then cross with experiment at some point in the history of physics. Sometimes theory comes before experiment. General relativity is maybe the most famous example. And sometimes, like fractional quantum Hall effect, experimentalists found it without a theoretical foundation, and then theory came in. In biology, I don't think we have a theoretical framework, and I wouldn't think that Darwinism and all this is a theoretical framework. So we don't have a theoretical framework, and therefore theory needs to build from scratch to build a framework of theoretical biology. And that's why I think the situation is completely different between physics and biology.
Can I make a comment on that, which relates to this earlier discussion on mathematics and biology? And the comment is, to my mind, one of the most spectacular predictions made in biology, certainly in recent biology, was the prediction of what's known as transfer RNA, an intermediary between transcription of the genetic material and its translation into proteins. Now, this was a prediction made by Crick, essentially based on notions which had nothing to do with theory in the sense we've been talking about it, mathematical modeling and so forth. But it was based on notions of what looked to him at that time like chemical common sense, the fact that you couldn't fit amino acids into the grooves of DNA or into mRNA, what seemed to him to be a nice kind of solution for cells to adopt. It's hard for me to find the correct words to describe this, but he did make the prediction. He stuck his neck out, and it turned out to be right. So I think there are different kinds of predictions, and therefore different kinds of theories that might be possible, or theoretical thinking that might be possible in biology.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Paulien, go ahead.
Paulien.
Well, I do think we can make some types of predictions, whether it's and so somebody said biologists want to see new things and theoreticians don't do that. Well, I think we do see new things, and a lot of new things. And well, I of course agree with Erez that theoretical physics has a much stronger foundation than theoretical biology. But we want to come to such a foundation. And well, although Erez doesn't agree that Darwinism is enough for that, I kind of agree with that. But it is certainly as a first principle we want to work with, and by extending that to an interaction with self-organizing systems and the trajectory that those systems take, I think we can at least work on a general foundation of biology, and I think that's worthwhile to do.
I just want to add a comment, if possible. I think that what is really missing, we don't have a methodology for theory of historical systems. And again, history is not just because of evolution. is every living system at every level that you look at, cell, tissue, organism, whatever, as a specific historical trajectory with it. And unfortunately, I don't see around a theoretical approach or methodology that allows to deal with historical systems. And that's, for me, it's the most serious barrier towards the theory of a living system.
Well, I agree that this is an extremely important point, but I think we have to explore that point. And so my point of doing these very open-ended type of simulations, where indeed the history at many different timescales do play a role, at least can give us an insight in that. So, and working towards, understanding the role of these multiple scales of historical influence is, I think, indeed a central point in what at least I would like to do in theoretical biology.
Sriram, you were going to say something, were you?
No, it is actually only a small clarification. I wanted to say that it's important to distinguish predictions coming from a theory from predictions saying, you see a particle coming in, you see a couple of particles going that way, there must be another particle going this way, so there must be a neutrino. The prediction of Pauli's argument for the neutrino was of the type, was not that different from Crick's argument for whatever. What I'm trying to say is that it's important in this discussion, I think, since we're talking about theoretical biology, to try to stick to predictions in the sense of having a theory and generating a prediction, rather than looking at something, musing a bit and saying, well, this couldn't work because without this. So I think focus should be on predictions from theory.
No, I think I didn't make myself clear. He did have a theory. What I'm trying to get at is that it was some kind of a connectionist theory. How does information go from DNA to proteins? What are the routes that it could take, which are consistent with chemistry? That was the challenge.
I'm just saying that that's. So I would describe that. I mean, you can find some other word for it. It's not theory in the sense of a generative set of principles.
No, but Schrödinger realized the aperiodic crystal as a source of information much before DNA structure was, and this was just by theoretical arguments that are completely physical and completely general. And for me, this is a lesson. I think we have enough data. Really, we don't need more data to build a theory of biology. This is an excuse. We have enough data, we have enough insights how to look on a living system. And now it's the aim of the theoreticians to build a framework that goes ahead with dealing with this point of historical system, of the complexity of living system, of functionality in living system, etc.
I agree. I don't know if that is addressed to me, but anyway, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, Paulien?
Well, I was saying that I agree with this point very much, but now the question is, how do we go about it?
This might be a good place to take up something that Vijay suggested, and which had been, I think, brought up earlier by Sriram, which is the education of physicists and biologists. How do you teach biology to physicists? And I think you mean physicists or engineers or computer scientists or anyone who's not a biologist. And how do you teach these other ways of thinking rather than the technicalities in those sciences to biologists? Does anyone have any thoughts about this? This, by the way, is a serious problem in our country. I think it came up in the discussion following Madan's talk as well. And it's certainly common here in India to see that young kids who are put off by mathematics, not necessarily physics, go into biology, and if they're put off by biology, they go into the physical sciences. So that's a rather negative way of getting into a field.
But
yeah, Francesca.
Just one important point, I think, for instance, Evelyn Fox-Keller wrote about that, is the big difference between the two subject matter of physics and of biology. In biology, you have, I mean, heterogeneity, variability is the rule. And so I think that physicists should be trained to understand this difference of object, and because in biology you cannot treat all the individuals, all the populations, all the entities you're talking about as the same. As you cannot make the same kind of idealizations, I think, and abstraction than you may in physics. But I mean, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a biologist, so I let the others, more competent people to.
Sriram?
No, actually, Apratim, he's already.
Yeah, so I suppose the way forward is through more engagement. You cited the example of Madan, right? For Madan, for a very long time, spoke to his biology colleague for years and years before they understood each other's language, right? So it's not just about coming up with a theory. And the thing is, there was this question raised before about the danger of biotechnology without understanding that. And so, in fact, in addition to his very provocative Arthur Eddington 1933 quote about theory, Professor Braun had another thing in his talk about the danger of biology becoming an engineering discipline without understanding, right? So there are checks and balances there, and the thing is, an engineering is worthwhile in its own right. Biotechnology is worthwhile in its own right, even when you don't have a full theoretical understanding, meaning you have had machines which exploited gravity even before you had a full understanding of gravity, right? So there are checks and balances in place, but I think if Sriram says that he's also scraping at the bottom or rock bottom in terms of theory in biology, and so then what I suppose Professor Braun is also alluding to is that we are at very nascent states of generating theories about biological systems. We have very experimentalists are just about putting some building blocks in places, and now it is the time to come up with the theories. And the thing is that the way to do that would be with active engagement, not to be meaning in these departments of physics and biology, but rather like Madan and Jitu did, by constantly talking with each other until they understood each other's languages a bit. Sriram?
Well, Senthil, is that a comment on this? Yeah, Sriram, sorry.
Very short. I just wanted to say that I think I resonate very much with what Apratim said. But before that, Francesca was talking about heterogeneity and the difficulty, sort of the messy complexity of the subject matter. That's fine. What I wanted to say was a positive thing, which is that if in the education of the typical science student, let us say physics student, you offer as examples of physical phenomena effects from the living world, instead of teaching them about bloody blocks sliding down inclined planes, you teach them about sap rising in trees, or you teach them about things flying or things swimming. You train their minds to think physically about biological problems. They'll automatically grow up understanding heterogeneity, complexity, and so forth, and they'll realize that, well, even then you can do physics about them. I think that's important. I totally agree with Erez on both the fact that maybe it's time, and on his mini program of saying that you need to incorporate historicity into models of interacting objects, for example. That's all fine. But I think you should also, in education at an early stage, in school, you teach them about physical phenomena in the living world. It makes a big difference. I didn't get any when I was a kid. So.
Sorry, what was your last point? I missed that.
No, I said I didn't get exposed to such phenomena. Otherwise, maybe I'd have done something more biological. I would have loved to learn such things.
Senthil had his hand raised and Gautam as well now, one of the two.
Sorry, so I completely agree with Sriram that if you build it up from ground up, students already know about biology while they use physics. That's a fantastic way to go about. What I was alluding to was what Apratim said: more engagement with physicists from a biological perspective, or biologists engaging more with physicists. I think. Starting at a lower level where physicists do help out biologists with some modeling of complex systems, extracting parameters or suggesting experiments that feedbacks into their design of what they're studying. I think that's a good way to start in the current situation, to start building towards more complex, larger biological questions. In all essence, nobody knows already how exactly to go about asking the big biological questions, but they have the building blocks in their hand. And when you start using them together, you might discover something better, or go for a new thing there.
Thanks, Senthil. Gautam?
Just to agree completely with Sriram that this has to be part of our education, that you learn to observe, and as much as you observe about the living world, let's even start with the non-living presence, because we just don't establish the connection between what we learn in class and what we see outside. There are many subparts of physics where it's much easier to demonstrate that connection, and this is something that we should do in general, as far as our pedagogy is concerned.
Sonali, you had something?
Yes, Vidya, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I just wanted to say, coming from a very traditional biology background and having taught undergraduate students in biology, microbiology specifically, and having a physics in my school, I don't know if this is a correct or incorrect assumption. I felt that biology is very specific and very context-based, while physics is more like general and universal principles. And so I don't know whether it's a debate between generalism on specificity, or is it this life as a natural continuum of non-life, and whether we can really put these two categories. Like in biology, we give terms like this bacterial species, E. coli versus Klebsiella. And, but in physics, it's like, it's more like, they're a part of the small parts form a whole. And here in biology, the whole are like they're in distinct categories. This categorization in physics is less apparent, and in biology is more apparent, because we have taxonomies and nomenclatures and all that. I kind of felt it. I may be totally incorrect in my assumption. Thank you.
Would a biologist like to comment on that? Kinneret, if you are there, would you like to say something? Vaishnavi?
Sorry, Vidya, I don't think I got the question.
Well, Sonali was referring to the importance of categorization and context dependence in biology. And in a rough sense, she seems to be saying that whereas you can make very general statements in physics, what you say in biology has to be rather specific, context dependent, that is.
Yeah, I'm gonna say something that's quite well, I guess it fits into what Sonali was saying. In a context-specific fashion, I think you can make general statements in biology, and I think I'm going to leave it at that.
But that's very interesting. Could you expand on that?
Well, I mean, of course, I look at cytoskeletal motor protein interactions, which are stochastic in nature. And there are very simple ways in which you can describe interactions between motor proteins and a cytoskeleton, for instance, which hold true not just in one organism, but are generally prevalent across multiple species. And so like I said, in a context-specific fashion, you can make a general statement about how something works in biology as well. It's just that we don't know enough about the same system in multiple organisms to make that statement in most instances. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah.
No, that sounds entirely plausible, but could it have something to do with the level at which you're making those statements?
Precisely.
Whether that's a molecular level or cellular level or organism
Precisely.
level?
That's what I meant by context in this case. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Vijay has something to say?
Yeah, no, I wanted to go back to the point of engagement that Senthil, Gautam, and Sriram raised. I too did not have the exposure to the living system, but now I'm here, I can't go back to school. So what would be some practical ways to actually make that engagement possible? Maybe in an Indian context or maybe in the broader context as well. I mean, should we do schools, regular meetings? What is the practical way here? That would be useful to get feedback on that.
Vijay, clearly all of the above, right? I mean, meetings like this, schools, and also sitting with a glass of something appropriate to drink. I mean, all of these play a role, right? And, you know, unfortunately, virtual meeting, that last one is not so easy. But I mean, we really need all of them. And it's not either or.
Yeah. No, but I also want to, it has to be on a continuous basis. One-off meetings, I think it's been realized now that the cultural divide is quite broad, and you won't get it off in one-off meetings. It won't happen in one-shot discussions. It has to be a continuous engagement on a regular basis, and probably it also means we need to train the next generation to start seeing these things. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. Other comments? It would be great. Practical ways of engaging.
I think it would be important to include in biology curriculum more theoretical biology. And so, well, we are teaching in a compulsory course for all biology students in Utrecht in the first year, and then with follow-up courses in the second and the third year. And well, we have, of course, a big drawback in that the mathematical background of many of our biology students are really, very, very bad. Nevertheless, there is certainly always a subset of the people who start to think different about biology because of this, this education that we give. But I think this education should be very much be given from and within biology point of view. If you are telling to the students, well, you first have to learn thermodynamics before you can start doing anything, well, then the divide is too large, actually. Right. I mean, then well, go to the physics department and learn thermodynamics, right? In enough detail to do anything with it. But I think to have a framework, and well, for me, I think the computational approaches are very doable there in that context. And well, just pin directly the education to interesting biological problems can do a lot there. So just don't hire in a physicist and say, well, you people have to learn physics and then we can start. I mean, that doesn't work. No, it should also be the other way around. Probably physicists should also realize the complexities of biology and not just relegate it to details. Yeah. That also won't work. Yeah. Thanks.
I can add just a comment. You know, Waddington between 66 and 70, it was mentioned before, and I mentioned it in my talk. He organized for every year a conference, bringing in mathematicians, physicists, biologists to discuss theoretical biology. This was published as 4 books that I recommend everybody to look at. He brought people like Bohm, René Thom, people like that, and also biologists, all kind, to discuss the methodology, how we deal with theoretical biology. And I think, sorry?
You mean the Waddington books?
Yeah, Waddington, the conferences were in Italy, but they were funded by Rockefeller Foundation. Yeah. So for 4 years, he did this, and all this effort was completely killed by molecular biology that became a fashion and took over. And my suggestion, to the community, if it was anything, is that we have to go back, a step back, and build again such conferences that will talk about methodology. This is not exactly about philosophy of the subject, but about the methodology. What we mean by theoretical biology, what we want to put into it, what are the obstacles along the way to theoretical biology. And I really suggest to go back, because we all realize that molecular biology by itself and all this understanding of all the bolts and all the parts in every living cell will not bring us to a picture or a framework that allows to understand a theory for living system. So this is my suggestion, that we have to take a step back and look back what Waddington tried to do, and maybe this is a good start for theoretical biology. You can find these books. There are 4 books on theoretical biology, theoretical biology. This is the title, from 66 to 70.
Thanks, Eris. Gautam, you had something to say?
Just a comment to Vijay's question. The university where I work has a course called The Principles of Science that every undergraduate must take pretty much in their first year. And that's a unique way of illustrating the parallel development of physics, biology, mathematics, chemistry together, so that you can understand how these different fields fed off each other as part of a natural history. And we don't present science in this way. We sort of teach a biology course, we teach a physics course, especially throughout school. You can avoid biology successfully, you can even avoid mathematics successfully beyond the 10th standard. But this is a way to bring it all back together. And I think this is a good idea, the fact that you it's a hard course to teach, but on the other hand, it's a necessary course. If you want people to begin talking to each other and to begin to appreciate different fields and the coherence of science, that really is a good way to proceed. I think it's an important way to proceed.
With a quick comment. So I was also trying to see at various levels. I completely agree with you. We should start from the school level, undergraduate or not. But then that'll take a long time and it won't happen soon. So I was also thinking at various levels that one could do that. Yeah.
One level, and I think you mentioned this, Vijay, or someone else did before. One level is that of working physicists, and I repeat, by that I mean physicists and engineers and computer scientists who might have an interest in biology, which is to attend biology seminars, sit through them, however bored they get the first time, the second time, maybe even the third time, and essentially learn by osmosis. It's a slow process, but in the long run it works and it's successful. And if they're lucky, they'll find something that clicks and stimulates them. At least they'll get an appreciation for the kind of language that's being used and the kinds of concepts within which people think. But it's a painful process. Gautam, is that you again?
No, it's just my hand up. I'll put it back down.
Your hand up, and Monish's hand too. I'm not sure if you have something to say.
Yes, if I could just add a comment, because one of the findings, at least here, has been that something called project-based learning, where you engage directly with the subject matter, not learning it sort of as lectures, but engaging directly, has been shown to be so powerful as a learning mechanism that it's the recommendation at least is that not having it seems to be almost like someone said that if this was the medical field, then not doing it would be like malpractice. And in that sense, it seems that one of the changes that is required is not simply that you have biology and mathematics sort of being taught simultaneously, but I would say even going beyond that, to just sort of remove boundaries in some sense, that when you are talking about anything, when you have this project-based learning mechanisms where you learn, not saying that this is biology, this is chemistry, this is physics, but something more melded together, where it's about something very concrete, it turns out that what the data shows is that the learning seems to be much better. And I think that, I mean, this is, of course, blue sky far away, that not having fields that are so restrictive automatically leads to people putting things together. And then if someone has a natural proclivity for having biology and mathematics be their thing, then that's what they will do. If someone else has computational plus biology, that's what they will do. Someone has biology, physics, that's what they will do. But the idea is to like put it all together as sort of a coherent whole and not very subdivided.
Samarth Sabu had a comment.
Yes, I mean, it is not related to the education of physics and biology. Can I go ahead?
Could you speak up, please?
Yes, it's not related to the physics and biology education that Vijay sir asked. So can I go ahead? Like,
please.
Okay. So actually, I have one question and a thought to share. So my question is, like, in line with what Professor Eres Brown and Professor Moinish talked about, like the pursuit of understanding the nature of life, and also I think which Bhumika had asked in the chat about a new language for a new science. So I had read a book a few weeks back called Biocentrism, which is by Robert Lanza and Bob Berman. So in which he talks about he says that we are actively involved in the process of our perception of the world, in the sense that there's a line in that which says space and time are not absolute realities but rather tools of the human and animal mind. So I found it interesting, and I would like to know if anybody has any thoughts or comments on that, because I was very interested to know. So this is my question. And another thing I would like to share with everybody is that whenever in most of the talks, I noticed that when we talk about biological systems, we say that they are very complex systems, like in the sense it's very difficult to understand. And we in the sense that so we said they're all complex systems. So I just felt that although we feel so when we try to understand the systems, it seems that the system itself just goes on like without any problems, or it's completely naturally happening and at ease. And also in Professor Mehek's talk, she had said that that now they're discovering different functions of lysosomes other than breaking down biomolecules. So she had mentioned saying that it's a good time for lysosomes, in the sense the recognition that it's getting in terms of functions. So I was just thinking the lysosomes themselves would be doing whatever they have to do, right? It'll be like if they were to say, they might say you can think whatever you want, but I mean I'll do what I have to do, in that sense. Like plants, animals, everything seems to be going well, even though we don't understand about it. Like they seem to be functioning at ease. I mean I don't know, this is what my thought was. My question was about the biocentrism book. Thank you.
Anyone who might want to respond?
I want to say something about complexity, may I?
Yeah, please.
At some point, complexity really helps because, a three-body problem is a terrible problem. We don't know how to solve it. But if you have many body problem, then statistical physics can come in and do all kind of things depending on the situation, of course. So in many cases, the fact that the system is complex and there is a mixing of all kind of modes, and it really helps in building understanding of the system and not an obstacle against it. So we shouldn't be afraid of complexity. The fact that complexity goes to it's really, very different from the complexity we see in non-living systems, might really help in building a theory for living systems.
Thank you, Eres.
Yeah, could I add a comment?
Yeah, please, Manish.
Sorry, really quick. This is again the last question, but also going back to Gautam's question about the predictability versus explainability. One thing that seems to me, comes from sort of the neural network, turns out that you can make some neural networks with very simple principles. The internal workings are so complex that nobody essentially understands. But the predictive power is so good, for example, as a medical tech for diagnosis that outperforms any physicians, and yet no one has a clue about what's actually the internal structure. How does it transform the data in a way that allows you to do this? And it seems to me that one part of this is that we are almost being held back by the fact that these explanations have to make sense to our specific cognitive capacity. I mean, we know that our cognitive capacities are severely limited. There's a wonderful book about all kinds of sort of illusions that we undergo just because of the way our cognitive system is set up through evolution. So it seems to me a little bit that we might be holding ourselves back by asking for explainability when that explainability has to be rooted in the way that our mind thinks, right? So we can imagine different ways in which things can work. So I don't know. We assume that 1 + 1 is 2, but again, this depends on your mathematical system and so forth. So I'm not really sure. And to answer the previous question of this biocentricism, there's also this centricism of that our explanations, the ones that fit our sense the best, are better explanations. So I'm kind of a bit cautious, and I want to say that I want to push for predictability. That if you have good predictions, but maybe not the best understanding, it could be a fault in our not a fault, but something to do with how that explanation interacts with our cognition. Just a comment I wanted to make.
Thanks. Abhijit?
Yes, I think that predictive success may not always depend on explanatory success. So you may be successful in predicting something, but you may not really grasp reality through that model or through that theory. So there may be divergence between predictive success and explanatory success on one hand, and coherence may not be the only criteria to judge explanation. There could be, whereas pragmatists or anti-realists cherish coherence as a criteria to judge the value of explanation, but there is a correspondence with that realists cherish about. So I think how we value explanation in science and whether coherence is the only value that we care about, that may also, one may also have to think about that. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Abhijit. Shall we leave the floor for the last question or comment to Sonali? It's getting close to 6 and we need to begin winding up. Sonali, could you please say whatever it is?
Thank you, Dr. Vidya. This is just a comment and extension of what Dr. Eris Brown said. He was talking about complexity. And it seems from this entire meeting of theoretical biology, there seems to be some sort of a silo of mathematics, physics, and biology. I was thinking, could we be missing the key point is scale or scale of complexity? Because Jeffrey West is this professor in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he works on complexity and related areas. And he was finding these universal scaling laws from organisms to cities. So I was thinking going further beyond organisms to like atoms and electrons, So when an underlying universality is found, which of course is questionable because we are always searching for coherence, is scale something that can be the connecting link of teaching these different subjects in so-called silos or whatever, and we used to connect all these subjects together. Scale. I was thinking of scale or scale of complexity. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we wind up now? It's been a very interesting afternoon, also a long afternoon. In fact, it's been a long fortnight for many of us. And I don't see any raised hands or comments in the making. So let me very briefly thank all of you for having attended this panel discussion session and made it such an enjoyable as well as informative educational experience, certainly for me. And in particular, let me thank Paulien, Sriram, Francesca, and Apratim for having agreed to be members of this panel with many qualms in the case of some of them, but nonetheless they came and did a superb job. Thank you very much indeed. This has been a fine conference, and it's been a pleasure working with Vaishnavi and Vijay. The two of them, needless to say, did the large majority of the hard work that needed to make this go. And with that, I'll pass on this link, I guess, or whatever it is, to Vijay. He has a few words to say at the end, and Vaishnavi as well.
Vaishnavi, you want to go? I want to thank some of the people.
I would just like to thank the participants and the speakers, of course, for having really made this conference possible. And of course, co-organizers Vijay and Vidya for really driving this. I really don't have anything else prepared. I didn't realize I was going to talk today. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So I just want to thank a bunch of people who, apart from the list here, who are really instrumental in making the meeting go smoothly. So first of all, of course, the speakers, the panelists, the session chairs, and all the participants for their interactive comments, questions, and participation in general. But also the ICTS Programs Office, ICTS for the funding, but also the ICTS Programs Office, which sort of kept together many behind the scenes aspects of running a program like that. And in this weird situation where we have to do things online, our IT team becomes very crucial, and they have to ensure that Zoom works on time, the links work, the passwords works, the YouTube channel works. So I want to thank these people whose faces we don't see. We only see them as ICTS-TIFR post, but the people behind the task are actually Gopi, Naveen, Shantraj, and Arun. And some of them are probably listening to me as I speak, but they're very important in keeping the meeting running. But one person who actually sort of put together the whole meeting from several months and probably bugged all the speakers and the panelists to send their titles and abstracts on time and take care of things is Anupama. Anupama is also somewhere here. If she can put up her video, that will be nice. And so we should all thank her a lot. That's been something, she has done a wonderful job at this piece of in the conference. So thanks to Anupama a lot. That's it. I want to thank everybody who has been part of this meeting. Wonderful. We really had a wonderful time, exhausting, as Vaishnavi and Vidya said. We will send you out a feedback form from the ICTS Programs Office. It will be great if you can respond and tell us what you felt about the conference. Is it something that we should do often? Such meetings should happen. If you want to suggest some changes in the format, the timing, whatever it be, it'll be great to get some feedback from everybody. Okay, so unless anybody else wants to add something, we can close it for the day, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you so
Bye.
much.